There's a selflessness in that, an innate selflessness,
Yes,
which is
a selfless engagement, but a passionate engagement. And one of the things I truly appreciated in the Occupy movement was their idea of shared leadership.
Yes.
And so I think that the future leadership will be the midwives of the world. And it's not just you and me, Andrew. Just look at the Occupy movement and how they were willing to share, at least in the way they organized themselves, share their leadership. So they would take an initiative and a group of people would support a leader, and at another time the same leader was supporting somebody else. So I think that's a huge paradigm shift, because the world today still looks up to traditional leaders, formal leaders.
And these systems are bankrupt. They're not working, they're corrupt. We need a grassroots revolution of love and wisdom in action. And it has to be led by leaders who aren't stars, who are midwives, who cooperate, who share wisdom and share resources.
Yes, Andrew, and I'd go one step further and say it's not just grassroots. What's the opposite word for grassroots in English? Like people in policy and
policymakers too.
Yeah,
of course, you can't neglect them.
Yeah, I would say that the change is not only going to be grassroots movements of shared leadership, it's going to be a different way in which formal leaders operate. That formal leaders are not hierarchical in their way of expression or their way of engagement, that they too are able to co-create with their peers, with people outside. And I think that change, whether that's business or
and that's what you work on a lot, because you're consulted for in business, you're consulted by management institutions, you're consulted by a whole range of people who have power, who want to learn a new way of being and doing things, because they know that you, with the practices that you did in the UN, with the kinds of programs that you did in the UN, you exemplified this kind of approach. So they know that you know how to do this and how it can be implemented.
I guess so, Andrew.
Oh, yes.
And also that I believe that in every bureaucracy there are wonderful people.
Yes.
There are people wanting to make a change. In every business there are people wanting to make that change. So for me, I have never looked at grassroots as the solution to human problems. I've looked at them as an ally, just as I've looked at business, just as I've looked at government, just as I've looked at the UN. And that's helped me not to exclude or demonize any group, but to include everyone, and yet include them in a way where we inquire into what's not working.
And we're held accountable for the practices that we're keeping going, which could be destructive.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That we inquire into those practices, that we create safe space to change those practices. Because for me, that's required at all levels, isn't it?
You've outlined the kind of work you're doing and the principles that govern that work. But I want to ask you something, Monica, as my great friend. Why, at this time in your life, are you pouring yourself out in this way? What burns in you? What made you care so much? What made Monica care so much? What happened in your past to give you such a sense both of urgency and the need to serve this chaotic emergence that we're all part of?
So I'd like to begin early on, and I think today, I didn't realize it then, I can see the influence of my parents. I can see that my father, who fought for India's freedom, who's the person post India's freedom, he was in the Indian civil service, he created the first pension scheme, and that was for plantation workers. It wasn't for management. And at home in 1955, I remember he bought a record of Paul Robeson, and Paul Robeson sang, and he said, you know, in our country, we also have problems like that. There it's race, in our country it's caste. And so for me, I grew up with a father who actually burned for justice. We always had children at home that my mother taught and we educated. There was always a conversation on integrity. There was always steps my father took when it was very hard to be absolutely incorruptible and had to pay a price for it. So I think that just sort of filtered in. So I imbued that aspect, I think, from my father's sense of what needs to happen in our country and in the world. And so we always thought of the world. We had music from everywhere. From my mother, I learned two things. I learned a love of animals. She loved animals. She loved nature.
My great passion too.
Yes. You know, a walk that should have taken us 10 minutes through the hills, because I was born in Shillong in the hills. Took us like hours because we looked at every fern, every flower, every butterfly. And I learned a second thing from her. We celebrated the festivals of every religion. So I went to Aurobindo Ashram, that was close by. We went to Ramakrishna Mission. We celebrated Eid with her best friend Miraja, who practiced Islam. We celebrated Buddha Purnima and went and you know, the monks on those days there was a ceremony where we would go and feed them. We celebrated Diwali. We celebrated Christmas. So there was something that was about celebrating the sacred.
Yes.
And
in all of its forms.
In all of its forms.
With the knowledge that it's all one.
Yes.
Yes.
And I was 6 years old. She took me to meet J. Krishnamurti.
My goodness.
And I was the only child in the room. And so I got to ask questions. And he said, well, listen to her questions, he said. And I met Dalai Lama when I was 7.
Wow. And
she took me to meet him, and I was blessed. So I grew up with that, and I could see that, and I think that shaped me. That's been one of my
It's wonderful because from your father you got this very deep, passionate sense of justice and the need to act to secure justice. And from your mother, you got this vision of the creation as holy and also of all the various religions as being facets of the one diamond of truth.
Yes.
And your life has actually brought these two together in what I would call sacred activism.
Yes, you know, I read Albert Schweitzer's life when I was in grade 3, and I went to my father and I said, I like what he's done, so this is who I want to be. And he said, well, princess, if that's what you want to be, that's who you'll be. And so for me, that's been a thing. The other thing that, Andrew, that's taught me a lot is death. And for me, it is, you know, when I go back and I look at my childhood, I'm the oldest born, and 5 of my brothers and sisters passed away. And I saw my mother and father weep, my mother weep. It's very hard for a 2.5-year-old to see your mother weep. And I think it did something to the way in which I hold life as celebration. And, you know, just a submission to just the passages of life. And our first son passed away, and I think that those are moments that have stayed with me and are hard and have taught me the beauty of life in a different way. Because it's, you know, those are the most precious things, and then when they go, then you wonder, what am I clinging on to, right? So it's been a great teacher for me.
I think too, Monica, being born in India, because I was born in India and lived my childhood in India, that in itself is a huge education of the heart, because you cannot escape in India the heartbreak of the world. It's all around you. There's tremendous suffering visible. And I think that is an initiation of a kind, isn't it, also?
Andrew, I wish I could agree completely with you. I agree with you when you say, isn't India a space where just everything exists all at once? The beauty of life, the horror of life.
Incredible beauty and the incredible horror.
Yes. Perhaps the space of great spiritual exploration and discovery, and a space that is extremely exploitative.
Yes.
So that's there. So if what you're
the
saying
whole of reality
to me,
in your face, yes.
in the same moment.
Yes.
So that is actually the power of that space. But what we do with that space is a different matter.
Yes.